Thanks so much for having me here. I'm really excited. Whenever You Got This has any events going on, I love to join them. They've given me a lot of advice around strengthening my core skills, so I'm just pretty thrilled to be involved. As Joe quite rightly said, my name is Jessica. I'm a developer advocate with Launch Darkly, and I came up with the idea of this talk in my first meeting with Kevin. We were chatting about the nature of events and projects and how complexity scales with scope. Okay, so I had this idea, it came up when we were talking about how projects scale, going from like virtual events to IRL events. He made the offhand comment that not everything goes up by an order of magnitude of one every time. And that observation really neatly summed up a lot of my experiences with projects and people, both professionally and personally, but also the research I've been doing around group organization and how that changes things. So in the next 20 to 30 minutes, or 25 minutes, I think, we're going to talk about how to avoid the common pitfalls that happen with siloed working and how to effectively distribute knowledge in a way that can help you gain visibility in your organization and just level up. So let's do this. Let's kick things off with identifying the complexities that arise when people organize into groups. You'd be forgiven for thinking that collaboration is always going to be the answer to our problems. We often pair program, we say things like two heads are better than one, and a problem shared is a problem halved. And it's understandable to think that bringing another person to the mix will stand to reduce our workload, to kind of ease our woes and get to a solution faster. But going beyond language, there are many instances where this logic is reinforced, and it's not always the case. If we're moving something heavy, more arms equals more power. Now, our perception of how work gets shared among many hands looks like this. We're used to thinking that more people getting involved makes things easier, but in reality, it often ends up looking a bit like this. These two graphs both originate from a collection of essays from The Mythical Man Month, a book from famed computer scientist Frederick Brooks. It originally came out in 1975, and it's been subsequently updated twice, and sort of once in 1982, once in 1995, but that's still a long time ago. And while its language and examples are in sore need of a refresh, particularly to reflect the more inclusive spaces that we're trying to foster and build in software today, the core underlying messages, some of them really ring true. I was in an event yesterday which referenced this very book. The director of engineering at Takeaway Giant Delivery Hero talked about the hero essay in this book, which discusses the perils of overstaffing and how this happens. In the essay that we're referencing, called The Mythical Man Month, it explains the unit of what they call a person month, which is a highly fictitious amount of time, a unit of progress rather, that a group of people can make relative to their quantity and the subsequent amount of time that a task takes them. So the idea is that the number of people and the amount of time required to get something done or get something working can be interchangeable uh, as commodities. And that's where the idea of the person month comes from. But this is only true when a task itself can be partitioned amongst many people with no communication between them about that task. Software development is one of those tasks that falls in between the two categories of it can be partitioned, but also we need handoff between each stage. We can break things down into smaller user stories. We can break things down into features. That is what we do every day. But we do need communication, even if it's just in the basic format of Git or a version control process. We need communication between each unit of work. And in these situations, the best possible outcome doesn't come close to an even trade-off of people versus hours. There are a couple of schools of thought around where the work lies, but it's widely accepted that intercommunication is where the majority of the work is concentrated. And if each part of the task you're working on needs to be coordinated separately between certain people, the effort required to complete that section of work increases at a rate of n to the power of n minus 1 over 2. That sounds a bit difficult to conceptualize, but essentially means that 3 people will require 3 times as much interaction as 2 people to get the same amount of work done. This graph here is kind of what I'm talking about. You kind of see this really sharp increase point when it hits about 3 or 4 people. And things only get compounded when we bring department-wide meetings into the mix. And the result of this leads to the effort of communication almost counteracting the division of labour. It can cause communication to be really difficult. And it led to the discovery of, or the sort of the the creation of this law called Brooks Law, which is that adding people power to late software projects only stands to make them later. But what does this mean? This isn't an argument against collaboration. Working together is integral to getting things done at scale. What I'm trying to do is make sure that we're aware of the pitfalls that happen in these scenarios, not dissuade communication as a whole. Communication is wonderful. We really need to keep talking, but we need to make sure that we're talking in a way that supports our overall goals of what we're trying to get done. Too much communication and people feel included, but things can sometimes slow to a halt, as we saw with those very exciting graphs that I showed, but also too little leads to another set of problems. People feel out of touch with the decisions being made. They lose motivation. They become disengaged. I mean, does this resonate with you? Have you ever kind of felt a little bit like out of the loop at work? Like things are getting decided without your input? At best, we end up working in silos, unable to collaborate outside of our immediate team, which might not sound like the worst thing, but when that problem gets compounded, it can lead to attrition and it can lead to people being disengaged with their responsibilities and the outcomes of their work. Now, all in all, this is not great at a individual or a team level. So how can we get the levels of communication just right? One of the ways to do this is to create a bit of a rhythm and a cadence around the way that we work. Establishing a sense of predictability can grow trust and help people engage in a bit of tacit communication where they feel communicated with, but they're able to act under known and tested assumptions that can contribute towards group success. Now, we're going to look at a couple of frameworks and a little bit of advice that you can use to model this in your interactions. And the next time that you lead a new project or initiative, hopefully you can put this into practice. Now, requirements, we encounter these quite a lot. These are usually discussed at a product level rather than a project level, but we can actually use the idea of a requirement as almost like a framework for understanding what's needed to meet our goals. A requirement at its core is a condition or capability needed to solve a problem or achieve an objective. And requirements engineering is a term that broke onto the scene around 1997. I do have a love for the 90s, but this talk will quickly speed up into the 2020s. And it evolved through a series of conferences and discussions, and then developed into a standard series of practices. The drawing up of requirements has now become a fundamental part of most life cycles and is referenced heavily, like all across the work that we do. But requirements engineering is a process of eliciting stakeholder needs and desires and developing them into agreed upon set of detailed requirements that can serve as a basis for all subsequent development activities. Now, the purpose of requirements engineering is to make sure that what's being stated is clear, complete, and that the solution proposed is correct, reasonable, and effective. That all sounds great. That all sounds really ideal. But in reality, kind of how does this come to life? It encapsulates about 4 steps here. We've got elicitation. That's all about understanding the needs of what we need to get done, understanding the needs of our stakeholders. If we're being tasked with a project, figuring out what are the core goals, what do we want our final solution to do, what sort of requirements do we want it to meet. Next, documentation. So clearly capturing those in a documented format that's referenceable and has a life cycle. And we're going to visit that point later. Clarity, completion, and accuracy are really key here. Documentation, we usually think of it as a one-way process, but documentation really ensures that we're engaging in active listening and that that we've understood the task correctly. Validation, that's the clear, continuous communication process that helps us validate our thinking. And then lastly, management, the final state that involves managing any changes that may arise along the way. That's doing this in a sort of transparent way. Now, these are all super broad concepts, but let's kind of drill down a little bit into what they mean when we put them into practice. So elicitation, that may be kind of getting a brief. Sounds pretty simple. But this first stage is essential for being able to start things off in a successful manner. Once you've gotten your brief and clearly defined the requirements, what's required, what does success look like, and really mapped things out in terms of the assumptions that we're making with the task, we want to kick off with, and don't hate me here, but maybe one meeting, one initial meeting to get everyone on the same page. And this is where you can relay your project brief really clearly with your team, define all of the requirements, or make sure that your defined requirements are stated and shared. And yeah, outline the work that we're intending to do going forward. Now, starting things off with a kickoff meeting that includes a bit of a user manual of how you want to work with each other is a great way to make sure that people are able to understand the processes that you want to take going forward. So the goal here is to prevent future meetings. Kick things off with a definition of the requirements, but also how you expect to work going forward. And then lastly, talk about what you want to achieve and clearly state the assumptions that you're making. Who are you making this product for? Who is this project aimed at? Along with the challenges that you've anticipated. Then ask for feedback. This is going to make sure that anything that you bring up at this stage is open for interrogation in a really honest, communicative way. When I was putting this talk together, I wanted to reach out to someone that I knew had a lot of project management experience, and that's Louise here. Please feel free to follow her on Twitter. She's a great resource for lots of project management tips and tricks. But she mentioned that the management of focusing on engaging people early is a really great way to start to establish trust. She said here that people and have an understanding of the business case and client requirements. The only way to really foster empathy is by practicing it. So that's why it's a great shout to get your meetings in early and then start to collaboratively define the way that you want to work going forward. How do you do this? I know that a lot of this advice is very applicable to many scenarios. As a sort of concrete example, I work on one of the ERGs at my workplace. And the way that I like to kick off for every year is by holding a quick meeting with the other ERG leads and the people responsible for managing the program managers of our ERG. Although this sounds like it contradicts the advice in the very first part of this talk, the great part of this is that it allows every idea that you bring up to be open to interrogation. You get to be truly collaborative from the get-go and take on board everyone's feedback. Then you have a starting point for all of your communications on Slack. Documentation is part of communication. It's where we transparently relay that we've understood something accurately, and it's one of the most important parts of knowledge distribution. Now, this book, written by my colleague Heidi Woodhouse, amongst other collaborators, goes into some brilliant practices and processes around technical documentation, and I highly recommend that you pick it up. As a guide to documenting with good practice, use tools that your team is used to using. If everyone uses Slack, stay in Slack. Now, of course, you can build the business case for a better tool if you need that, but make sure that you're using something that people are familiar with. That's an agenda point that you can add to your initial kickoff meeting. How does everyone want to work and what tools do they want to work with? Making sure that you're being collaborative in the tools that you use is also a really good way to keep people engaged. I think there was a study done recently talking about how people having autonomy over the tools that they use leads to overall project engagement. So if the people that you're working with get to choose their tools and you get to work with what they find the most easy to use, that's how you're going to hopefully keep your documentation fresh in their minds and heavily referenced, which is of course what it's there for. It's there to be read. Secondly, give your information a life cycle. It will not stay relevant forever. And make sure it's updated and it has a lifespan so people know how often to check the changes and how much they can trust it. So by standardizing both the tools and the patterns by which we operate, we grow to understand what to expect from each other. Here you can see a typical pattern for communication. This robust pattern invites collaboration in a really predictable and controlled way, and it tries to minimize context switching if done if done in the right way. The key here is to also minimize cognitive load. If people use what they're used to using, they won't have to think about how many people should I tag in this post? Is this the right way to do this? Do people tend to use Atlassian? Do they use templates? Is Miro the best tool for this? If you are really intentional and really specific about how you start to document the information for your projects, then this layer of thinking won't even need to happen. People can only do what's expected of them, and by creating a defined process, we instill a thing that we can entrust, that we can trust and work to improve. And in practical terms, when you're thinking about how this might work with, say, incident response, look at Slack integrations, look at Teams integrations, look at what you can build on top of what you already have. Now, step 3, validate. Now, this is where you understand how many of your assumptions are correct and how much of the information you've documented is useful. Now, this is a stage that you want to really lean on quite heavily. This is a part of the process that you can start to dig deeper into certain areas. You can start to understand, where are people asking the most questions in your brief? Where is the most misunderstanding? As a example here, I was chatting to someone a while ago about learning TypeScript, and I started to get some feedback around which projects I should start to include in my brief and in my outline. Here you can see that building small sample sites as a first project is a really good option. And that's quite a good bit of advice, but I might have assumed otherwise. I might have assumed that I should focus on only exercise-based learning. So validating your approach here is just a really useful way to make sure that you're staying on track. It's a great way to ensure honest communication and to make sure that you are course correcting as you go. I love this point here by Jim Rohn. If someone's going down the wrong road, they don't need motivation to speed up. What they need is education to turn around, and that might be what you need. Now, management is a kind of final point, and that's a very, very broad term. But essentially, what we're going to talk about is what happens when things go wrong. Now, dynamic complexity is something that comes into our projects quite a lot of the time when we're dealing with technology. As engineers, we're hedging our own ability to understand new knowledge. We're hedging our own selves to be able to figure out something new most of the time that we're joining a new project. And software gets complicated really fast. Sometimes you can't know what you don't know. And that sort of idea of an area of complexity that has the ability to change is called dynamic complexity. Now, going back to some advice from Louise, she kind of talked about how planning for the unknown is something that you inevitably have to do when you encounter a project. You don't know what's going to go wrong. And sometimes the best option is to make sure that you've set up those really clear communication cadences, those weekly check-ins, or that daily stand-up routines on a project, even if it's just quite a small project that you've been tasked with. So you can share early what's going wrong and what you suspect might be happening and how that's going to impact the overall schedule. To do this, you've got to create a bit of a blameless culture. Now, a blameless culture doesn't focus on where someone went wrong. It focuses on a system or a process that failed, and it can really increase our tolerance to bad news. Now, one of the things that a blameless culture leads to is a bit of psychological safety. And that's where people can show up to projects. They can show up without fear of consequences. Everyone on your team, your project group, they need to feel empowered to speak up if things are moving too fast, if they're concerned about the direction that you're going in, or if things are at risk of going wrong. And the only way you can do that is by keeping on talking about things that are both good and bad, and then establishing that both of those things are okay to voice. One of the ways of doing this is to focus on what or how. Don't ask about why, because it's easy for people to become defensive with the why. Obviously, we need to question motives and keep things going, but sometimes in difficult environments, we need to really raise the baseline when it comes to psychological safety. We might be coming from a place that's psychologically quite unsafe, and we might be use a new project as a way to refresh our way of working. And a good way to start doing that is to focus on how. How did an outage happen? How did it happen? This how helps us to make curiosity and learning a priority. It helps us to reward great questions and foster inquisitiveness in our ways of work in our teams. And lastly, Making sure that we have time to play and experiment is a really great way of making sure that we're not overexerting ourselves and making every point of our project stressful. Maybe we have one or two requirements that are soft requirements or less important than the others, less critical, and are kind of like nice to haves. That's potentially our area where we can add our project flair or have a bit of individualism or exert ownership over a product a bit. Essentially, you want to make sure that your knowledge management is a moving object. You want to make sure that you're distributing what you learn, you're effectively using it, and you're capturing the outcomes of implementing that knowledge. Here's a little bit of a TLDR, and I'd love to speak to you about what you're working on. If you're working on a new project or a new initiative at work, please hit me up in the DMs, and I'd love to work with you on how you can work to include a bit of requirements engineering in your day-to-day working to make sure that what you create is a bit of a success. So thank you so much. I really appreciate you listening to me, asking questions, keeping it dynamic, and I'd love to chat.